not the kind of guy who believes in monsters. Hell, I've been hunting these mountains for 20 years, and the biggest thing I ever worried about was a black bear, or maybe getting lost in a whiteout. But what happened to me and my buddies last November changed everything. I'm telling this story because people need to know what's really out there in the deep woods. The official report says it was a bear attack, but that's bullshit. Bears don't plan. Bears don't hunt humans like we're prey. And bears sure as hell don't seal you in a cave to die. Me, Ken, and Bobby had been hunting together every season for the past 8 years. We weren't trophy hunters or anything fancy like that. Just 3 guys who like getting away from our wives for a long weekend, drinking beer around a campfire, and maybe bringing home some venison if we got lucky. Ken was the tracker of our group. That man could follow a deer trail through solid rock if you gave him enough time. Bobby was our cook and camp manager. He packed enough food to feed an army and somehow always remembered the things the rest of us forgot. Extra batteries, first aid kit, that kind of stuff. We'd picked a spot about 12 miles into the Monongahela National Forest, way past where most hunters bother to go. The area was thick with oak and maple, perfect deer habitat, and far enough from the main trails that we wouldn't have to deal with weekend warriors taking pot shots at anything that moved. Ken had scouted it the previous spring and found plenty of sign, rubs, scrapes, well-worn paths heading to water. We drove up Friday morning in Ken's pickup, bouncing along Forest Service roads that got narrower and rougher with every mile. When the road finally ended at a small clearing, we loaded our packs and hiked another 3 miles to our campsite. It was a nice spot, a flat area beside a creek sheltered by big trees with good sight lines in case something wandered through. Setting up camp took most of the afternoon. We pitched our tents in a triangle around the fire pit, hung our food high in the trees to keep the bears away, and tested our radios to make sure they worked. The weather was perfect, cool and crisp, with hardly any wind. Ken found fresh deer sign within 100 yards of camp, so we were feeling confident about our chances. That first evening was exactly what we had hoped for. We grilled some steaks Bobby had brought, opened a few beers, and planned our strategy for the morning. Ken wanted to work the ridge to the north, where he had seen the most sign. Bobby and I would take the valley bottom, following the creek downstream to a meadow about a mile away. We'd meet back at camp by noon to compare notes. Around midnight, I woke up needing to take a leak. The fire had burned down to coals, and the forest was dead quiet except for the creek babbling nearby. I stepped outside my tent and walked about 20 feet into the trees. As I was finishing up, I heard something that made me freeze. A low grunt, like a pig, but deeper. It seemed to come from across the creek, maybe 50 yards away. I listened for another minute, but didn't hear it again. Bears make all kinds of weird noises, so I figured that's what it was and went back to bed. We were up before dawn, coffee brewing over the camp stove while we loaded our rifles and checked our gear. The morning was cold enough that our breath steamed, but once we started moving, we warmed up quickly. Ken headed up the ridge while Bobby and I followed the creek. The plan was simple: move slowly, glass the open areas, and try to spot something before it spotted us. For the first few hours, everything went according to plan. We found plenty of deer sign, tracks in the mud by the water, fresh droppings, places where they'd been browsing on young saplings. Bobby even spotted a small doe around 10 in the morning, but she was too small and too far away for a clean shot. We let her walk. Around noon, we were heading back toward camp when Bobby stopped dead in his tracks. He was staring down at something in the mud beside the creek. When I caught up to him, I saw what had gotten his attention. A footprint, clear as day in the soft earth. But it wasn't from a deer or a bear or anything else I recognized. The print was huge, maybe 18 inches long and 8 inches wide, with 5 distinct toe marks. It looked almost human, except no human foot is that big. The toes were thick and spread out like whoever made it was used to walking on rough ground without shoes. The print was deep too, like whatever made it was carrying a lot of weight. Bobby knelt down next to it and held his own boot up for comparison. His size 11 looked like a child's shoe next to that thing. We looked around and found 2 more prints heading away from the creek into thick brush. They were spaced out like whatever made them had a stride longer than any person I'd ever seen. We took some pictures with Bobby's phone and marked the spot with some orange surveyor's tape. When we got back to camp, Ken was already there, cleaning a nice 6-pointer he'd taken that morning. We showed him the photos, and his expression changed from pride to confusion. Ken had been hunting longer than both of us combined. He'd seen every kind of track these mountains had to offer. After studying the photos for a few minutes, he shook his head and said he'd never seen anything like it. We spent the rest of the afternoon trying to figure out what could make a print that size. The only thing that came close was a black bear walking on its hind legs. But bear track don't have 5 toes like that. That second night felt different. Maybe it was because of the strange tracks, or maybe because the forest seemed quieter than usual, but none of us slept well. I kept waking up to small sounds, twigs snapping, leaves rustling. The kind of noises that happen all the time in the woods, but somehow seemed louder and more deliberate. Around 2 a.m, I heard that same grunt I'd noticed the night before, but closer this time. It seemed to come from just outside the circle of light from our dying campfire. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle and stepped outside my tent. Bobby and Ken were already awake. I could see their flashlight beams moving around their tents. I called out quietly to see if they had heard it too. Ken's voice came back tense and low. He'd been hearing movement for the past hour, something big walking around our campsite, staying just far enough away that the flashlights couldn't pick it up. We spent the next 20 minutes listening and watching, but whatever it was had gone quiet. In the morning, we found more tracks. Something had walked a complete circle around our camp during the night, staying about 30 yards out. The footprints were the same as the ones we'd found by the creek, huge, 5-toed, and deep. Whatever had made them was heavy and walking upright. Sunday morning, we packed up our gear and moved camp deeper into the valley. Ken thought we were being watched and wanted to put some distance between us and whatever was making those tracks. We hiked about 2 miles downstream to a spot where the creek made a sharp bend around a steep hillside. It was more isolated than our first camp, but it felt safer somehow. We could see anyone approaching from 3 directions. We spent the morning hunting, but our hearts weren't really in it. The excitement of opening weekend had been replaced by an uneasy feeling that we weren't alone in these woods. Every shadow between the trees made us stop and stare. Every bird call made us reach for our rifles. Around noon, Ken found something that turned our unease into real fear. About a quarter mile from our new campsite, he discovered what looked like a shelter, a crude lean-to made from broken branches and dead logs. It was big enough for something the size of what we'd been tracking, and it looked recently used. The ground around it was packed down hard, and there were bones scattered nearby. Deer bones mostly, but some that looked like they might have come from smaller animals. The smell was what really got to us. It was a mix of rotting meat and something else, something wild and musky that made your nose burn. Ken took some pictures and backed away slowly. When he got back to camp and showed us what he'd found, we decided we'd had enough. We were packing up and heading home. While we were breaking down camp, the noises started. At first, it was just an occasional wood knock, the sound of something hitting tree trunks in a rhythm. Tap, 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 then silence, then tap, tap, tap from a different direction. Ken said he'd heard of this before. Some hunters claimed Bigfoot used wood knocking to communicate over long distances. As we stuffed our gear into our packs, the knocking got closer and more frequent. Soon we were hearing it from all around us, north, south, east, west. It was like we were surrounded. Bobby suggested we try making some noise back, maybe bang on a tree with a stick to show we weren't afraid. Ken and I both told him that was a terrible idea. By the time we had our packs loaded and were ready to move, the wood knocking had stopped. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind in the trees. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring and your skin crawl. We started hiking back toward the truck, moving as fast as we could with heavy packs. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes when we heard the first howl. It came from behind us, back toward our old campsite, and it was like nothing I'd ever heard before. Not quite human, not quite animal, but something that raised every hair on the back of my neck. The sound echoed through the valley for what felt like forever. Then we heard an answer, another howl, this one from our left, somewhere up on the ridge, then another from the right. We were being tracked by multiple creatures and they were talking to each other. Ken took point, Bobby brought up the rear, and I stayed in the middle. We picked up the pace, half jogging when the terrain allowed it. Every few minutes we'd hear another howl, always from a different direction, always seeming to get closer. It was clear now that we weren't just being watched, we were being herded. About an hour into our hike, we crested a small rise, and Ken suddenly dropped to one knee, holding up his fist for us to stop. He pointed ahead to a cluster of large boulders about 50 yards away. At first I didn't see anything. Then one of the shadows moved. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall and covered in dark brown hair. It stood upright like a man but had the build of a gorilla with arms that hung almost to its knees and shoulders so broad it looked like it could flip a car. The thing was just standing there watching us, making no attempt to hide. We stared at each other for what felt like an hour but was probably only 30 seconds. Then the creature let out a roar that shook the trees and started walking toward us. Not running, walking, like it knew we couldn't get away and was in no hurry to catch us. All three of us turned and ran. We crashed through the brush, branches tearing at our clothes and packs, not caring about the noise we were making. Behind us, we could hear heavy footsteps and the sound of small trees being pushed aside like they were weeds. We ran for maybe 10 minutes before Bobby stumbled and went down hard. When Ken and I turned back to help him, we saw them, 3 of the creatures, coming through the trees in a line like they were driving us toward something. They moved with purpose, not the random wandering of animals, but like hunters who knew exactly what they were doing. Bobby had twisted his ankle in the fall and couldn't put weight on it. Ken and I grabbed him under the arms and half carried, half dragged him toward a steep section of hillside where we thought we might be able to lose them. The creatures followed at a steady pace, never getting closer but never falling behind either. We reached the base of a cliff and realized we'd made a mistake. There was no way up with Bobby injured, and the creatures had us trapped against the rock face. That's when Ken made the decision that probably saved our lives. He told us to spread out and get ready to fight. I'd brought my grandfather's .30-06, a rifle that had taken more deer than I could count. Ken carried a .308 and Bobby had a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with slugs. Between the 3 of us, we had enough firepower to stop a grizzly bear. We hoped it would be enough for whatever was coming after us. The first creature broke from the tree line about 40 yards away. In the afternoon light, I could see it clearly for the first time. Its face was almost human, but wrong somehow. The jaw too big, the brow too heavy, the eyes too small and set too deep. Its arms were longer than any person's, and its hands ended in thick, black fingers that looked like they could crush bone. Ken fired first. His shot took the creature high in the chest, and it stumbled backward but didn't go down. Instead, it let out a sound I'll never forget. Part roar, part scream, full of rage and pain. The other two creatures appeared on either side of the first one, and all three of them charged. Bobby's shotgun boomed twice in quick succession. I saw one of the creatures spin and fall, dark blood spattering the leaves behind it. My own rifle kicked against my shoulder as I put a round center mass into the biggest one. It dropped to one knee but kept coming, using its knuckles to pull itself forward like a wounded gorilla. That's when everything went to hell. The wounded creature that Ken had shot reached us first. It grabbed Ken around the waist with one massive arm and lifted him off the ground like he weighed nothing. Ken was screaming and trying to bring his rifle around, but the thing's grip was too strong. I heard his ribs crack like dry wood. I was trying to get a clear shot when the second creature hit me from the side. It felt like being tackled by a refrigerator. I went down hard, my rifle flying into the brush. The creature pinned me to the ground with one hand while it reached for my throat with the other. Its breath was horrible, like rotting meat and wet fur. Up close, its eyes were completely black, with no white showing at all. Bobby was still fighting, working the action on his shotgun and putting rounds into anything that moved. But there were more of them now. I could hear crashing in the brush as others approached. The creature on top of me was too heavy to throw off, and its fingers were closing around my neck. I was starting to see spots when Bobby's shotgun went off right above my head. The blast caught the creature in the side of the skull, and it rolled off me, thrashing and making a sound like a wounded horse. I scrambled away looking for my rifle and saw Ken on the ground 20 feet away. The creature that had grabbed him was still holding his body, shaking it like a rag doll. Ken wasn't moving. Bobby was backing toward the cliff face, his shotgun trained on the tree line. His face was white as paper, and I could see his hands shaking. Two more creatures emerged from the brush, moving more carefully now that they'd felt our bullets. One of them was dragging its left leg, dark blood matting the fur on its thigh. The wounded creature I'd shot was still alive, still crawling toward us with its one good arm. Bobby put another slug into its head, and it finally stopped moving. But there were still 3 of them left, and Bobby was almost out of ammunition. I found my rifle and worked the bolt, chambering another round. One of the creatures was circling to our left, trying to flank us. I led it like a moving deer and squeezed the trigger. The bullet caught it in the shoulder and spun it around, but it didn't go down. These things were incredibly tough. The creature that had killed Ken dropped his body and turned toward us. Even from 30 yards away, I could see Ken's blood on its hands and chest. It opened its mouth and roared, a sound so loud and deep it seemed to shake the ground under our feet. Then it charged. Bobby's last shot took it square in the chest at 15 yards. The slug knocked it backward, but it kept its feet and kept coming. I put my final round into its head just as it reached us. The impact snapped its neck back and it finally went down. But our celebration lasted about 2 seconds. More howls echoed from the forest around us, not just 1 or 2, but what sounded like a whole pack. We'd killed 3 of them, but there were others, and they were closing in. Bobby grabbed Ken's rifle and what ammunition he could find. I reloaded mine with my last few rounds. We couldn't carry Ken's body, and both of us knew we'd be lucky to get out of there alive ourselves. It was the hardest decision I've ever made, leaving my friend like that, but there was no choice. We started climbing the cliff face, looking for any way up and out of the valley. The rock was loose and crumbly, and with our heavy packs, we could barely make progress. Behind us, we could hear the creatures crashing through the brush, getting closer with every passing minute. About halfway up the cliff, Bobby's pack caught on a ledge and tore open. Half his gear tumbled down onto the rocks below. Food, extra clothes, his sleeping bag. We didn't stop to gather it. We just kept climbing, our hands cut and bleeding from the sharp rock. Near the top of the cliff, I found a narrow ledge that led around the face of the rock toward what looked like a gap in the ridge. It was barely wide enough for one person, with a drop of at least 100 feet to the rocks below. But it was our only option. Bobby went first, his back pressed against the rock wall, sliding sideways inch by inch. I followed, trying not to look down. The ledge was slick with moisture and covered in loose gravel that threatened to give way under our boots. Halfway across, we heard howling from directly below us. When I looked down, I saw two of the creatures at the base of the cliff looking up. One of them started climbing. The thing climbed like a spider, finding handholds in rock that looked smooth to me. It moved fast too, covering in minutes what had taken us nearly an hour. I could see its eyes reflecting what little light filtered down from above, and they never left us. We reached the gap in the ridge just as the creature pulled itself over the top of the cliff behind us. Bobby squeezed through first, then me. The opening was tight, just barely wide enough for a person with a pack. As I pulled myself through, I felt massive fingers brush against my boot. I kicked backward as hard as I could and felt my heel connect with something solid. The creature let out a grunt of pain and released its grip. On the other side of the ridge, we found ourselves in a different valley, one neither of us had seen before. The terrain was rougher, full of fallen logs and boulder fields that made walking treacherous. But we had no choice except to keep moving. We could hear the creatures behind us howling to each other across the ridge. We hiked all afternoon, stopping only when we absolutely had to rest. Bobby's ankle was getting worse, the one he'd twisted when we first ran, and he was limping badly. Every step was obviously painful, but he never complained. We both knew that slowing down meant dying. As the sun started to set, we realized we were completely lost. Nothing looked familiar, and the valley seemed to stretch on forever in both directions. Ken had been our navigator, and without him, we were just guessing. We had maybe 2 hours of light left, and the creatures were still following us. We could hear them howling every 20 or 30 minutes, always from behind, always getting closer. We found a small cave in the hillside just as darkness fell. It wasn't much, just a hollow in the rock about 10 feet deep and 6 feet wide, but it gave us shelter for the night. We crawled inside, pulled some dead branches across the opening, and tried to rest. Sleep was impossible. All night long, we heard them moving around outside, heavy footsteps circling our hiding spot, occasionally stopping right at the mouth of the cave. Once, something pushed against the branches we'd piled up, testing them. We sat in the dark with our rifles ready, waiting for them to break through. But they never did. As the first light of dawn crept into the cave, the sounds finally stopped. We waited another hour before moving the branches aside and looking out. There were tracks everywhere in the soft earth around the cave mouth. The same massive 5-toed prints we'd been seeing since yesterday. We had to get out of that valley. Bobby's ankle was swollen to twice its normal size, and we were down to our last few energy bars and a half-empty water bottle. Worse, we were still completely lost. Every ridge looked the same, every valley seemed to lead deeper into the wilderness. We decided to follow the valley downstream, hoping it would eventually lead to a larger creek or river that we could follow back to civilization. It was slow going with Bobby limping, but we made steady progress. For the first few hours, the forest was quiet. No howls, no wood knocking, no sign that we were still being followed. Then, around noon, Bobby spotted movement on the ridge above us. At first, it looked like a black bear walking along the skyline, but when it stopped and turned toward us, we could see it was walking on 2 legs. It stood there for several minutes, just watching us, then disappeared back into the trees. 10 minutes later, we saw another one on the opposite ridge, then another behind us, back the way we'd come. They were tracking us like a pack of wolves, staying high where they could watch our movement while remaining out of rifle range. The harassment started in the early afternoon. They began throwing rocks down at us from the ridges, not trying to hit us directly, but landing close enough to let us know they could. The rocks were big, some the size of footballs, and they hit the ground with enough force to shatter. If one of those had connected with a person, it would have been lights out. We picked up the pace as much as Bobby's ankle would allow, but the creatures picked up theirs too. Soon they were ahead of us, behind us, and on both sides. Every time we looked up at the ridges, we could see dark shapes moving through the trees. They were herding us again, just like they had at the cliff face. Late in the afternoon, the valley began to narrow. The creek ran between two steep ridges that rose almost straight up on both sides. It was like walking through a canyon, except with trees and undergrowth instead of bare rock. There was only one way forward and one way back. About halfway through the narrow section, Bobby stopped and grabbed my arm. Ahead of us, maybe 100 yards away, one of the creatures was standing in the middle of the creek. It was the biggest one we'd seen yet, at least 9 feet tall and built like a linebacker. It wasn't moving, just standing there blocking our path. We turned to go back the way we'd come, but there was another one behind us, and this one was carrying what looked like a club, a thick tree branch with the small end broken off. We were trapped between them with steep ridges on both sides and no way to climb out. Ken would have known what to do. Ken would have found a way out of this. But Ken was dead, and it was just me and Bobby with maybe 8 rounds between us, facing creatures that had already proven they could take multiple rifle shots and keep fighting. The one with the club started walking toward us. The one in the creek stayed put, blocking any escape in that direction. We were caught in a pincer movement that showed more intelligence than any animal should possess. Bobby raised his rifle and took aim at the closer target. At 30 yards, even with his hands shaking, it should have been an easy shot. But when he pulled the trigger, nothing happened. The firing pin clicked on an empty chamber. In our panic, he'd forgotten to reload after the fight at the cliff. I still had 3 rounds left. I worked the bolt and put my first shot into the creature's chest. It staggered but kept coming. My second shot hit it in the shoulder and spun it around. My third and final shot took it in the head and it finally went down. But the other one was already moving. It charged up the creek toward us, water splashing around its feet, that massive club raised over its head. Bobby was frantically trying to reload, but his hands were shaking so badly he kept dropping cartridges. When the creature reached us, it swung that club like a baseball bat. Bobby tried to duck, but he was still off balance from his injured ankle. The club caught him across the side of his head with a sound like a melon hitting concrete. He went down instantly and didn't get back up. I don't remember picking up Bobby's rifle. I don't remember running. The next thing I knew, I was crashing through thick brush on the side of the ridge, branches tearing at my clothes, my pack long since abandoned. Behind me, I could hear the creature howling, whether in rage or triumph, I didn't know. I ran until my lungs felt like they were going to burst, then kept running. The ridge was steep and covered in loose rock that shifted under my feet with every step. Twice I went down hard, scraping my hands and knees raw. But I got back up and kept moving. As darkness fell, I found myself in a section of hillside honeycombed with small caves and rock shelters. Most were too shallow to provide real protection, but near the top of a rocky outcrop I found a narrow opening that led back into the mountain. It was just wide enough for me to squeeze through, but no way something the size of those creatures could follow. I crawled back into the cave as far as I could go, maybe 15 feet. Until the passage narrowed to the point where I couldn't move forward anymore. There I sat in complete darkness, listening to my own breathing and the sound of my heart hammering in my chest. I don't know how long I waited before I heard them outside. Heavy footsteps moving around the rocky area, pausing at different cave mouths, investigating. Once, a beam of light, Moonlight or starlight was blocked out completely as something large moved past the entrance to my hiding spot. Then I heard scraping sounds, like something being dragged across rock. The sounds got closer to my cave entrance, and I realized with growing horror what was happening. They weren't trying to reach me, they were sealing me in. The scraping continued for what felt like hours. Occasionally, I'd hear grunts of effort, like the sounds humans make when lifting something heavy. Gradually, the faint light that had been filtering in from the cave entrance began to dim. They were piling rocks in front of the opening, building a wall to trap me inside. I crawled forward as far as I could and felt around in the darkness. Where the cave mouth used to be, my hands found only solid rock, a barrier of stones fitted together so tightly that no light could get through. I was sealed in a tomb of my own choosing. Panic hit me like a physical blow. I clawed at the rocks until my fingernails broke and my hands were bleeding, but the stones were too big and too tightly wedged for one person to move. I could hear my own breathing getting faster and more shallow as the reality of my situation set in. I was going to die in this hole in the ground, and no one would ever find my body. I tried to control my breathing and think rationally. The cave extended back maybe 15 feet before it got too narrow to crawl through. The air felt stale but not poisonous. There had to be some kind of ventilation, maybe cracks in the rock that were too small to see. I might have a day or two before the oxygen ran out. My water bottle had been in my pack, which I'd lost during the run up the ridge. I had no food except a half-empty pack of beef jerky in my jacket pocket. No flashlight, no matches, no way to signal for help. Just me and the dark and the growing certainty that I was going to die alone. I spent that first day trying everything I could think of to escape. I felt along every inch of the cave walls, looking for loose rocks or cracks I might be able to widen. I tried digging at the floor with my hands, thinking maybe I could tunnel under the rock wall. Nothing worked. The cave was solid granite, and the barrier blocking the entrance was built to last. The hunger wasn't too bad yet, but the thirst was getting worse. My mouth felt like cotton, and my lips were starting to crack. I tried to ration the spit in my mouth, but there wasn't much of it. Every few hours, I'd suck on the beef jerky for the moisture, but that just made me thirstier. The worst part was the silence. In the complete darkness of the cave, my other senses seemed to get sharper. I could hear my own heartbeat, the sound of air moving in and out of my lungs, even the rumbling of my empty stomach. But from outside, nothing, no wind, no birds, no sign that there was still a world beyond my rocky prison. I tried to stay positive by thinking about my wife and kids, about the things I'd do when I got out of there. But as the hours dragged by, those thoughts got harder to hold on to. More and more, I found myself thinking about Ken and Bobby, wondering if their bodies were still lying where they'd fallen or if the creatures had dragged them away. By the second day, I was getting weak from dehydration. The beef jerky was gone, and my mouth was so dry I could barely swallow. I'd stopped trying to move the rocks. I didn't have the strength left to budge stones that would have been heavy even when I was at full strength. I must have dozed off sometime in the afternoon because I woke to the sound of scraping outside the cave. For a moment I thought I was dreaming, but then I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of rock against rock, like someone was moving the barrier. Hope flared in my chest. Maybe it was a search party. Maybe someone had found the abandoned campsite and followed our trail. I pressed my ear against the rock wall and listened. The scraping continued for several minutes, then stopped. I waited for a voice, for someone to call out, but there was only silence. Then, suddenly, light began to seep through cracks in the rock wall. Not much, just thin beams of what looked like moonlight. But after more than a day in complete darkness, it was blinding. I heard one final scraping sound, much louder than the others, and then heavy footsteps moving away from the cave entrance. I waited. I don't know how long, maybe an hour, maybe 3. I was too afraid to move, too afraid that whatever had opened the cave was waiting outside for me to emerge. But eventually, thirst won out over fear. I crawled forward and began working at the rocks. The barrier was still there, but it had been partially dismantled. Whoever or whatever had moved the rocks had left a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I pushed aside the remaining stones and crawled out into the night. The forest was empty, no creatures, no search party, no sign of what had freed me from the cave. Just moonlight filtering through the trees and the sound of wind in the branches. I sat on the rocks outside the cave entrance for several minutes, trying to make sense of what had happened. Why would the creatures that had killed my friends and sealed me in a cave come back to let me out? It made no sense. Maybe it hadn't been them at all. Maybe a bear had knocked some of the rocks loose, or maybe the barrier had just shifted on its own. But the rocks I'd found scattered around the cave entrance were too big and too deliberately placed for that to be the explanation. I was free, but I was still lost in the middle of nowhere with no food, no water, and no idea which direction would lead back to civilization. My rifle was still in the cave, but I was too weak to crawl back in and get it. Even if I had it, I only had 2 rounds left. Not enough to make a difference if the creatures came back. I picked a direction that seemed to lead downhill and started walking. My ankle was twisted from the climb up the cliff, and every step sent pain shooting up my leg. But I had to keep moving. Staying in one place meant dying. For 2 days, I stumbled through the forest, following game trails and creek beds, eating whatever berries I could find and drinking from puddles when it rained. I lost probably 15 pounds in those 2 days, and by the time I reached the Forest Service road, I was barely able to walk. The strange thing was, I never saw or heard the creatures again. No howls, no wood knocking, no massive footprints in the mud. It was like they just vanished, or like they decided I wasn't worth pursuing anymore. Maybe killing Ken and Bobby had been enough for them. Maybe they made their point. A park ranger found me collapsed beside the road on Wednesday morning. I was delirious from dehydration and exposure, mumbling about monsters and caves and dead friends. They got me to a hospital, pumped me full of IV fluids, and called my wife. When I was finally coherent enough to tell my story, nobody believed me. The sheriff listened politely and took notes, but I could see in his eyes that he thought I was suffering from trauma and hypothermia-induced hallucinations. The Park Service launched another search for Ken and Bobby, but they never found their bodies. After a week, the official report listed their deaths as the result of a bear attack. I tried to tell people what really happened. I showed them the photos Bobby had taken of the first footprint we'd found, but digital photos can be faked. I described the creatures in detail, their size, their intelligence, the way they'd hunted us like prey. Most people listened with the kind of polite attention you give to someone who's clearly been through something terrible, but might not be thinking straight. My wife believed me, or at least she said she did. My kids were too young to understand what I was talking about. Friends and neighbors treated me like I'd suffered a breakdown, something they needed to be gentle about, but not necessarily take seriously. The worst part was going to Ken and Bobby's funerals and listening to people talk about the bear attack that had killed them. Their families deserved to know the truth, but what was I supposed to say? That their husbands and fathers had been murdered by creatures that weren't supposed to exist? That the Park Service and the Sheriff's Department were either covering it up or too incompetent to recognize what had really happened? I kept quiet and let people believe what they wanted to believe. It's been 3 years since that hunting trip, and I've had time to research what happened to us. never believed in monsters until one started killing my livestock. What I'm about to share happened on my farm in northern Michigan, where I've raised cattle and chickens for the past 15 years. The attacks began 3 years ago, and what I captured on my trail camera still gives me nightmares. This is my story, and the proof is real. It was a cold February morning when I found the first victim. The snow crunched under my boots as I made my usual rounds to check on the animals. Everything seemed normal until I reached the chicken coop. The door hung open, swaying in the winter wind. Inside, feathers covered the floor like fallen snow, and 3 of my best hens were missing. At first, I blamed a fox or coyote. We get plenty of them around here, especially in winter when food gets scarce. But something felt wrong. The chicken wire had been torn apart with incredible force, twisted metal jutting out like broken bones. No fox could do that kind of damage. Even a coyote would struggle to bend thick gauge wire that way. I spent the morning fixing the coop and reinforcing the wire mesh. The missing chickens were a loss I could handle, but I couldn't afford to lose more. These animals were my livelihood, and every death hit my bank account hard. 2 weeks later, it happened again. This time I lost 5 chickens, and the damage was worse. The wooden frame of the coop had deep scratches gouged into it, marks that looked almost like claw marks, but far too large for any local predator. The scratches went deep into the wood, at least an inch in some places. I ran my fingers along the gouges, feeling the splintered edges. Whatever made these marks had serious strength behind it. I called the local game warden, hoping he might have some insight into what kind of animal could cause this damage. He came out the next day, a tired-looking man in his 50s who had seen plenty of predator attacks over the years. He walked around the coop, examined the scratches, and shook his head. "Never seen anything quite like this," he admitted. "Could be a bear, but they're hibernating this time of year. Might be a really aggressive coyote, or maybe someone's dog got loose." I nodded, but deep down, I knew it wasn't a dog. The damage was too systematic, too purposeful. Dogs kill for food or territory, but they don't typically tear apart structures with this kind of precision. This felt different, almost calculated. Over the next 6 months, the attacks continued every few weeks, always at night, always when the weather was overcast or stormy. The creature seemed to prefer darkness and bad weather, times when visibility was low and sounds were muffled by wind or rain. The pattern was always the same. I would wake up in the morning to find damaged fencing, torn chicken wire, or broken wooden planks. A few animals would be missing, never more than 2 or 3 at a time. Sometimes I found partial remains scattered around the farm, but never enough to identify what kind of predator was responsible. In April, it went after my cattle for the first time. I found the young bull in the far pasture about a quarter mile from the barn. The sight made my stomach turn. The animal had been killed with incredible violence, its throat torn open and chunks of flesh missing from its hindquarters. But what disturbed me most was how clean the kill was. There were no signs of a struggle, no trampled grass or broken fence posts. It was as if something had overpowered a 1,200-pound bull without any effort at all. The financial loss was devastating. That bull was worth $3,000, money I couldn't afford to lose. But the emotional impact was worse. I had raised that animal from a calf, watched it grow strong and healthy. To see it butchered like that filled me with a rage I had never felt before. I spent that entire day walking the property, looking for tracks or any sign of what had killed my bull. The ground was soft from recent rain, perfect for preserving footprints. I found plenty of cow tracks, some deer prints, and my own boot marks from earlier visits to the pasture. But I also found something else. Near the bull's body, pressed deep into the muddy ground, was a single footprint unlike anything I had ever seen. It was roughly the size and shape of a large dog's paw, but the proportions were all wrong. The print was longer and narrower than any dog track I knew, with claw marks extending well beyond the pad impressions. Most disturbing of all, the depth of the print suggested whatever made it was extremely heavy, far heavier than any dog or wolf. I took photos of the print with my phone, measuring it against my boot for scale. The track was almost 8 inches long and nearly 6 inches wide. I had been around animals my entire life, had tracked deer and other game since I was a boy, but I'd never seen anything like this print. After losing the bull, I knew I had to take action. I couldn't afford to keep losing animals, and I needed to know what I was dealing with. I drove into town and bought 4 trail cameras, the kind hunters use to monitor deer movements. They weren't cheap, but they were my best hope of identifying the predator. I spent an entire weekend installing the cameras around the farm. 2 went near the chicken coop, positioned to cover different angles of approach. The 3rd camera went near the cattle pasture where I had found the bull. The 4th I placed along a game trail that ran through the woods behind my property. Figuring whatever was doing, this might use the same path repeatedly. The cameras were motion activated with infrared night vision. If anything larger than a squirrel moved within their range, they would snap a photo and record the date and time. I checked the SD cards every few days, hoping to finally get a clear look at my tormentor. For 2 months, the cameras captured nothing but deer, raccoons, and the occasional fox. I started to wonder if the creature had moved on, or if maybe the cameras themselves were deterring it. Some animals can sense the infrared flash and avoid areas where cameras are placed. Then, in late June, the attacks resumed. I lost 3 more chickens, and this time the damage to the coop was even more severe. Entire sections of wooden planking had been ripped away, and the metal hinges on the door were bent beyond repair. It was as if something had grabbed the structure and twisted it apart with its bare hands. The force required would have been enormous, far beyond what any normal animal could produce. But this time, I had hope. One of the cameras was positioned perfectly to capture whatever had done this damage. I hurried to check the SD card, my hands shaking with anticipation as I loaded the files onto my computer. Most of the photos showed nothing unusual: a raccoon sniffing around the coop at 2:47 a.m., a barn cat walking past at 4:13 a.m. Then, at 3:22 a.m., sandwiched between the innocuous wildlife photos, was an image that changed everything. The trail camera had captured something that defied explanation. In the greenish glow of the infrared flash, a figure stood near the chicken coop. At first glance, it looked almost human, standing upright on 2 legs with long arms hanging at its sides. But the proportions were all wrong, and the features were clearly not human. The creature stood at least 7 feet tall, with a muscular build and long, powerful limbs. Its body was covered in dark fur or hair, and its head was elongated, almost canine in shape. The eyes reflected the camera flash with an eerie, bright glow, and I could make out what appeared to be a snout and pointed ears. Most unsettling of all were the hands. They looked almost human in structure, with long fingers and opposable thumbs, but they ended in curved claws that caught the light of the camera flash. These were the hands that had torn apart my chicken coop, the claws that had left those deep gouges in the wooden planks. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't a bear or a wolf or any known animal. This was something else entirely, something that walked upright like a man but had the features of a predatory animal. The local legends came flooding back to me, stories I had heard as a child about the Michigan Dogman, a creature that was said to roam the forests of the Great Lakes region. I had always dismissed those stories as folklore, campfire tales meant to scare children. But here was photographic evidence that something matching those descriptions was real, and it had been terrorizing my farm for months. The next morning, I called the game warden again. This time I had proof, clear photographic evidence of what had been killing my livestock. I was excited, vindicated, and certain that someone in authority would finally take my situation seriously. The warden arrived that afternoon, bringing a colleague from the Department of Natural Resources. I showed them the damaged chicken coop, pointed out the claw marks in the wood, and then proudly displayed the trail camera photo on my laptop screen. Their reaction was not what I had expected. The two men looked at the photo, then at each other, then back at me with expressions of barely concealed annoyance. The game warden shook his head and closed the laptop with more force than necessary. "You really think we're going to fall for this?" he said, his voice heavy with sarcasm. "This is obviously fake. You can make anything look real with Photoshop these days." I protested, tried to explain that I wouldn't know how to fake such a photo even if I wanted to, but they weren't listening. They had made up their minds before I even showed them the evidence. To them, I was just another attention-seeking farmer trying to get sympathy for normal predator losses. "Look," the DNR officer said, "we understand you've had some livestock losses and we're sympathetic to that. But filing false reports and creating fake evidence is a serious matter. We could charge you with interfering with a wildlife investigation." The game warden nodded. "We're going to let this slide with a warning and a fine this time. But if you contact us again with more of these fantasy stories, there will be consequences." They wrote me a citation for filing a false report, a $300 fine that felt like a slap in the face. I watched them drive away, feeling more alone and helpless than I had ever felt in my life. The people who were supposed to help me had not only dismissed my evidence, but punished me for bringing it to their attention. That night, I realized I was truly on my own. If the authorities wouldn't help me, I would have to protect my animals myself. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into fortifying the farm with an obsession that bordered on mania. I couldn't afford to lose any more livestock, both financially and emotionally. I started with the chicken coop, completely rebuilding it with pressure-treated lumber and reinforcing every joint with metal brackets. Instead of chicken wire, I installed heavy-gauge welded mesh that would require bolt cutters to breach. The door got 3 separate locks and a metal frame that could withstand significant force. Around the coop, I built a secondary fence made of 8-foot-tall posts with razor wire along the top. It looked like something you might see around a prison, but I didn't care about appearances anymore. I only cared about keeping my animals safe. The cattle presented a bigger challenge. I couldn't build a fortress around an entire pasture, but I could make it harder for predators to approach undetected. I cleared all the brush and small trees within 50 yards of the fence line, eliminating hiding spots. Motion sensor floodlights went up every 100 feet, turning night into day whenever something large moved near the pasture. I also invested in an electric fence system, running hot wire along the top and bottom of the existing fence post. The voltage was set high enough to deter any animal or anything else that might try to climb over or dig under the barrier. For weeks, my modifications seemed to work. The attacks stopped, and I began to hope that maybe I had finally solved the problem. The creature, whatever it was, had apparently decided my farm was too well defended and moved on to easier targets. I should have known it wouldn't be that simple. On a humid August night, I was awakened by the sound of panicked animals. The chickens were making a tremendous racket, and I could hear the cattle bellowing in distress from the far pasture. I grabbed my rifle from the bedroom closet and rushed outside, my heart pounding with adrenaline and fear. The scene that greeted me was devastating. Despite all my reinforcements, the creature had somehow breached the chicken coop defenses. The welded mesh had been torn apart like tissue paper, and the metal door frame was twisted into an unrecognizable shape. 3 chickens were missing, and the survivors huddled in the corner, too terrified to make a sound. But the real shock came when I checked the cattle pasture. One of my cows lay dead near the fence line, its throat torn open in the same brutal manner as the bull months earlier. The electric fence had been ripped down, the hot wire snapped and coiled on the ground like dead snakes. What disturbed me most was how easily all my defenses had been overcome. Months of work and thousands of dollars in materials had been destroyed in a single night. The creature had adapted to my countermeasures and found ways around every obstacle I had put in its path. Standing there in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by the destruction of my efforts, I felt a crushing sense of defeat. This wasn't just about losing livestock anymore. This was about being systematically terrorized by something that seemed to take pleasure in demonstrating its superiority over my attempts at defense. I spent the rest of that night sitting on my porch with the rifle in my lap, watching the tree line for any sign of movement. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound made me jump. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but I couldn't bring myself to go back inside and leave my remaining animals unprotected. 3 nights later, I heard the familiar sounds of distressed animals coming from the pasture. This time, I was ready. I had been sleeping in my clothes with the rifle beside the bed, and I was outside within seconds of hearing the first bellows of panic from the cattle. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to see across the pasture without needing a flashlight. I moved carefully along the fence line, trying to spot whatever had spooked the animals. The cows had gathered in a tight group near the barn, all facing toward the far end of the pasture where the property bordered the woods. Then I saw it. At the edge of the tree line, partially hidden by a cluster of thick bushes, was a dark figure. Even at a distance of several hundred yards, I could tell it was tall and upright, moving with a fluid grace that was both human and animal-like. This was the creature from the trail camera photo, the thing that had been terrorizing my farm for months. My hands shook as I raised the rifle and peered through the scope. The figure was mostly in shadow, but I could make out enough detail to confirm what I was seeing. The elongated head, the powerful build, the way it moved on 2 legs but maintained a predatory crouch. This was no bear or wolf or any other normal animal. I took a deep breath, steadied my aim, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, shattering the night silence. Through the scope, I saw the figure jerk and stumble backward into the trees. A sound echoed across the pasture, a howl of pain and rage that was unlike anything I had ever heard. It was part wolf, part dog, but with an almost human quality that made my blood run cold. I had hit it. After months of frustration and helplessness, I had finally struck back at my tormentor. But my moment of triumph was short-lived. As the echoes of the howl faded, I realized what I might have done. If this creature was part of a pack, if there were others like it in the woods, I had just declared war on something far more dangerous than a simple predator. I stayed outside for the rest of the night, rifle ready, waiting for retaliation that never came. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made me spin toward the sound, finger on the trigger. I expected to see glowing eyes emerging from the darkness, expected to hear the sound of multiple creatures moving through the underbrush. But the woods remained silent. The next morning, I walked out to where the creature had been standing when I took the shot. The area was thick with brambles and fallen logs, making it difficult to search thoroughly, but I was determined to find some evidence of what had happened. Near a large oak tree, about 20 feet from where I remembered seeing the figure, I found what I was looking for. Dark stains on the bark and scattered drops in the fallen leaves below. Blood, definitely blood, and quite a bit of it. I followed the blood trail deeper into the woods, marking my path with strips of orange surveyor's tape so I wouldn't get lost. The trail was easy to follow at first, with regular drops and smears on trees and bushes. Whatever I had hit was bleeding heavily and apparently struggling to move through the dense undergrowth. The trail led roughly northeast, toward a section of state forest that bordered my property. I had hunted in these woods many times over the years, but I had never ventured very deep into this particular area. The terrain was rough, full of ravines and thick stands of cedar that made travel difficult. After following the blood trail for about half a mile, it suddenly stopped. I searched the area carefully, looking for any sign that the wounded creature had continued in a different direction, but found nothing. It was as if whatever I had shot had simply vanished. Near the spot where the trail ended, I found something interesting. Scratched into the bark of a large maple tree were deep claw marks, fresh one that hadn't been there on my previous hunting trips through this area. The marks were similar to what I had found around my chicken coop, but these seemed different somehow, more frantic, more desperate. I also found tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on the low branches of several bushes. The hair was unlike anything I had seen before, thicker and coarser than deer hair, but not quite like the fur of any domestic animal. I collected several samples, wrapping them carefully in plastic bags for later examination. But despite the blood, the claw marks, and the hair samples, I found no body. Whatever I had shot was wounded, possibly seriously, but it had survived and apparently escaped deeper into the forest. From that night forward, the attack stopped completely. Days passed, then weeks, with no sign of the creature. My remaining livestock went about their business undisturbed, and I began to sleep through the night again without being awakened by sounds of panic from the barn or pasture. The trail cameras I had positioned around the farm continued to snap photos of the usual wildlife, but there were no more mysterious figures, no more glowing eyes in the darkness. It was as if the creature had simply vanished from the area entirely. I should have been relieved, and part of me was. The financial losses had stopped, and I no longer lived in constant fear of what I might find each morning when I went to check on the animals. But the abrupt end to the attacks raised more questions than it answered. Had I killed the creature after all, and it had simply crawled off somewhere to die? The amount of blood I had found suggested a serious wound, possibly fatal. But if it had died, where was the body? I had searched the area thoroughly and found no trace of remains. Maybe the creature had been part of a pack, and the others had carried off their wounded or dead companion. That would explain the sudden disappearance of evidence, but it raised the terrifying possibility that there were more of these things in the woods around my farm. Or perhaps I had wounded it badly enough that it decided to leave the area entirely, seeking easier hunting grounds where it wouldn't face armed resistance. This seemed like the most logical explanation, but it also implied a level of intelligence that was deeply unsettling. Months have passed since that night, and I still have no answers. The creature has never returned, and I have never found any conclusive evidence of what happened to it. The hair samples I collected were examined by a veterinarian friend, but he couldn't identify the species. The blood trail photos I took have been studied by wildlife biologists who dismiss them as evidence of a wounded deer or bear, despite my insistence that the circumstances were different. I continue to maintain the defenses I built around my farm, though they no longer seem necessary. The motion sensor lights still flood the property with artificial daylight whenever anything large moves near the buildings. The reinforced fencing remains in place, and I still sleep with the rifle within easy reach. The trail cameras continue to document the normal wildlife that moves through my property at night. Deer, raccoons, foxes, and the occasional black bear all make appearances in the photos, but none of the mysterious figures that once haunted my farm. Sometimes, usually on dark, stormy nights when the wind howls through the trees, I find myself wondering if the creature is still out there somewhere. Maybe it's watching from the deep woods, waiting for me to let my guard down. Maybe it's moved on to terrorize some other unfortunate farmer. Or maybe it died from its wound in some remote corner of the forest, and its bones are slowly being scattered by scavengers. I may never know the truth about what happened that night or what the creature really was. The photograph from my trail camera remains the only clear evidence I have that any of this actually occurred. Local authorities continue to dismiss it as a hoax, and most people who see it assume it's some kind of digital manipulation. But I know what I saw, and I know what I experienced during those terrifying months. The Michigan Dogman, or whatever you want to call it, is real. I have the scars on my bank account and the reinforced buildings on my farm to prove it. The attacks have stopped, but the memory remains. Every time I walk across my property at night, every time I hear an unexplained sound from the woods, I remember those glowing eyes staring back at me through the camera lens. I remember the devastating strength that could tear apart metal fencing like paper, and the intelligence that adapted to every defensive measure I implemented. The trail camera image remains the centerpiece of my story, the one piece of evidence that cannot be easily dismissed. I've studied it countless times, examining every detail for clues about the creature's nature and origins. The figure in the photo is clearly not human, despite its upright posture and roughly human proportions. The head is too elongated, the limbs too long, and the overall build too muscular for any person. The reflective eyes and visible fangs mark it as a predator, something designed by nature or evolution to hunt and kill. But it's also not entirely animal. The way it stands, the structure of its hands, and the apparent intelligence behind its attacks suggests something that bridges the gap between human and beast. This is what makes the creature so unsettling, so difficult to categorize or understand. Wildlife experts who have reluctantly examined the photo point out various details they claim prove it's fake. The lighting is wrong, they say, or the proportions don't match any known animal. But they can never explain exactly how such a convincing fake might have been created, especially by someone with no training in digital manipulation. I've offered to let forensic experts examine the original SD card from the trail camera, hoping that technical analysis might prove the authenticity of the image. So far, no one has taken me up on the offer. It seems that most people would rather dismiss the evidence than confront the possibility that something like this might actually exist. My experience is not unique. Over the years, I've connected with other farmers and rural residents throughout Michigan who have reported similar encounters. The details vary, but the core elements remain consistent. A large, upright creature with canine features that preys on livestock and seems to possess human-like intelligence. Most of these people have never reported their experiences to authorities, having learned from cases like mine that official response ranges from dismissive to hostile. Instead, they've formed an informal network sharing information and strategies for protecting their property and animals. What emerges from these collective accounts is a picture of a phenomenon that has been occurring throughout the Great Lakes region for decades, possibly much longer. The creatures, whatever they are, seem to be territorial and generally solitary, which might explain why encounters are relatively rare despite the large number of rural properties in their apparent range. The attacks follow predictable patterns. They target easy prey like chickens and young livestock. They prefer to operate under cover of darkness and bad weather, and they seem to be deterred by bright lights and human activity. But they also demonstrate problem-solving abilities that go far beyond normal animal behavior, adapting their tactics when faced with new defensive measures. I've spent countless hours researching possible explanations for what I experienced on my farm. The theories range from the scientific to the supernatural, and none of them provide completely satisfying answers. Some researchers suggest that creatures like the Michigan dogman might be surviving members of an unknown species, perhaps a remnant population of prehistoric predators that managed to avoid extinction by retreating to remote wilderness areas. This would explain their apparent intelligence and their ability to avoid human detection for so long. Others propose that these creatures might be the result of modern genetic anomalies, animals that have undergone unusual mutations due to environmental factors or disease. While this might account for their unusual characteristics, it doesn't explain the consistent reports that span multiple generations. The supernatural explanations are even more varied, ranging from shape-shifting entities to interdimensional visitors. While these theories cannot be scientifically tested, they do attempt to address the seemingly impossible aspects of encounters like mine, such as the creature's ability to appear and disappear without leaving traces. Personally, I lean toward the theory that these are flesh and blood animals, probably mammals, that have evolved or adapted in ways that allow them to thrive in the margins of human civilization. Their intelligence and adaptability would be survival traits, allowing them to exploit human resources while avoiding direct confrontation with our superior numbers and technology. The months of terror I experienced have left permanent changes in how I view my property and my place in the natural world. I used to feel like the master of my small domain, confident in my ability to protect my animals and maintain my way of life. Now I understand that I am just another species sharing this land with things I don't fully understand. The financial losses were significant, but the psychological impact has been even greater. I find myself constantly vigilant, always listening for sounds that might indicate the return of my tormentor. Even during daylight hours when logic tells me I am safe, I catch myself scanning the tree line for signs of movement. My relationship with local authorities has been permanently damaged by their dismissive response to my evidence. I no longer trust that help will come if I need it, and I've learned to rely entirely on my own resources for protection. This isolation is perhaps the most difficult aspect of the entire experience. But there have been positive changes as well. I've become more aware of the wildlife that shares my property, more respectful of the wilderness that surrounds my farm. I've also connected with a community of people who have had similar experiences, and there is comfort in knowing that I am not alone in facing the unknown. 3 years have passed since the attacks began, and more than a year since they ended. I continue to farm the same land, raise the same animals, and maintain the same routines that have defined my life for decades. But everything is different now, colored by the knowledge that there are things in the world that defy easy explanation. The creature that terrorized my farm may be gone, but it has left an indelible mark on my understanding of reality. I know that somewhere in the vast forests of northern Michigan, predators roam that are not found in any biology textbook. I know that the boundary between the civilized world and the wilderness is far more porous than most people believe. I also know that most people will never believe my story, regardless of the evidence I present. The photograph from my trail camera will be dismissed as a hoax, and my account will be filed away with countless other tall tales from rural America. This is perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the entire experience, having lived through something extraordinary and being unable to convince others of its reality. But for those few who have had similar encounters, for those who understand that the world still holds mysteries that science has yet to explain, my story serves as both a warning and a reassurance. The creatures are real. They can be dangerous, but they can also be driven away by courage and determination. The Michigan dogman exists. I have the photograph to prove it and the scars on my property to remember it by. Whether it will return someday, whether others like it continue to roam the forests of the Great Lakes region, I cannot say. I can only continue to live my life with the knowledge that the world is far stranger and more dangerous than most people ever imagine. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is howling through the trees and the motion sensors are casting their harsh light across my fortified farm, I remember those glowing eyes staring back at me through the camera lens, and I know that some mysteries are better left unsolved. For more interesting stories, check this out.